Welcome everyone. I am Michelle Gold, board chair at Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you all for joining us for today's program, Building Bridges, which is our monthly discussion series that brings together leaders of community organizations for a conversation about working toward common social justice goals. For today's discussion, we are so pleased to welcome leaders from each of our four partner organizations: Julie Bank, board chair for Jewish Center for Justice; Michael Lawson, president and CEO of Los Angeles Urban League; Helen Torres, executive director of Hispanas, Organized for Political Equality, HOPE; and Nancy Yap, executive director, Center for Asian Americans United for Self-Empowerment, CAUSE. The conversation will be moderated by Dan Schnur, professor at USC's Annenberg School of Communication and board member at Holocaust Museum LA. Holocaust Museum LA brings you programs like today's discussion at no charge. If you're enjoying our programs, we ask that you consider supporting our work by making a donation to the museum at holocaustmuseumla.org. It is now my pleasure to formally introduce the moderator of today's program, Museum Board Member Dan Schnur. Dan is a professor at USC Annenberg School of Communications, UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, and Pepperdine School of Public Policy. Dan currently presents a weekly webinar for the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall, which is called Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. As one of California's leading political strategists, Dan has worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns. He served as the National Director of Communications for the 2000 presidential campaign of US Senator John McCain, and he was the chief media spokesman for California Governor Pete Wilson. Dan, thank you so much for helping us create the Building Bridges program and for serving as moderator today. Thank you.
Michelle, thank you so much. And maybe what we can do, since we have, it appears, attracted a fairly regular group of attendees over the months that this program has been running, is shorten my introduction next month so we can get to the questioning a little bit sooner rather than later. I'm excited to be here, as I am every month, and being joined by Nancy Yap, by Julie Bank, by Helen Torres, and by Michael Lawson. I think we could have a particularly interesting and a particularly important discussion today. I think as we've been gathering over the months, we've explored a number of topics together. But here we now sit 27 days from the next election, an election not just for President of the United States, but candidates up and down the ballot, as well as ballot measures as well here in California, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. And so one of the terrific things about the organizations represented on this panel is they are primarily devoted to educating the members of their respective communities and our broader community as well. And so as we'll hear later, they will often take sides on a particular ballot measure or policy challenge if it's of great import to them. But their primary role is one of education. And because we are talking about the election during such a highly fraught campaign election year period, I'd remind all of our audience members that the goal here today isn't necessarily to persuade someone, to help someone make up or change their mind, but rather to provide information and insight from a variety of perspectives. So with that caveat, we're going to get right to the questioning. And what I'd like to do to begin is start more broadly with each of the 4 of you. And maybe what I'd like to ask you to do is to tell our audience, to tell our group that's gathered here today, what observations would you offer about voting behavior, both current and voting history, among members of each of your own communities? And so, Julie, I'm going to ask you to talk first, and I'm wondering what insights you'd like to share with the rest of us about voting behavior in the Jewish community to get the conversation started.
Thank you so much, Dan. And it's such a pleasure to be back with these other great panelists and participate today once again, representing Jewish Center for Justice. So first, I want to start off by saying the right to vote, among other freedoms, was really one of the driving reasons for many of our Jewish ancestors to come to the United States. They came from countries where they were not granted full citizenship, and they certainly, because they were Jews, and they certainly did not have the right to vote. And voting was suppressed among other peoples of that country as well, but especially Jews of those countries. US citizenship has really allowed them the freedom and the right to vote, and they were able to know that their vote was going to count. American Jews today really do exercise their right to vote. And in my research about this, which it was very fascinating research, as you and I have talked about a little bit, since 1968, 71% of American Jews favor Democratic candidates, 25% choose Republican candidates. I looked at a nonpartisan poll that was conducted in May of 2019, and I found that Jewish voters overwhelmingly prioritize domestic policy issues that relate to Jewish values. Among those were providing access to affordable health care, combating the rise of white supremacy, which is on the top of all of our minds today, and protecting individual rights, including reproductive and same-sex marriage. One interesting fact that I just want to end with is that 95% of Jewish voters have strongly favorable views of Israel and are pro-Israel. But of the 16 policy priorities that were presented in the poll, Israel was the 16th in terms of what voters chose to prioritize, and above those were all of the domestic policies. So I just thought that that was a really interesting fact about the voting priorities. So sorry.
Not a problem at all. We'll think of that as an exclamation point.
There you go. Oh my gosh.
Well, I think it's fascinating insights, Julie. In particular, the polling you cited on the importance of issues in the community. I spend a lot of time talking to candidates who are not Jewish, from both parties, who assume that Jewish voters want to hear first and foremost about Israel, and being reminded that while it's an important issue, it's one of many, is I think a very important reminder. So thank you very much. Helen, I'd like to come to you next, because as is the case with the Jewish community, Latino and Latina voters are certainly not single-minded in their politics either. And I'm hoping you could offer some further insights behind that very surface introductory comment that would be helpful to our members about how to watch the Latino and Latina voters as this election year continues to unfold.
Absolutely. So thank you for this, Dan, and thank you again to the Holocaust Museum of LA for hosting this continuous dialogue. The key thing to remind that I always advise individuals about the Latino vote and how to start gauging it is don't go by the headlines of any major newscaster that is not Telemundo or Univision, because you'll start seeing the headlines saying the Hispanic vote is decreasing for Biden or increasing for Trump. But you have to really understand what they mean by that. And so traditionally when you see those types of headlines, what you have to look at is, are they looking at polling that's being conducted in the East Coast, specifically in Florida, or somewhat in the Southwest, or the South, more in specifically Texas? And why it's important to look at those states in particular is because, as Dan has mentioned, the Latino vote is not a one block type of voter. We are made up of a variety of different origin countries. We are, Latinas and Latinos come from predominantly born in the US, but when it comes to immigration, we come from a variety of different countries and different ways in which we immigrated to the United States. And oftentimes how we have immigrated to the United States really projects how we're going to be voters in the United States, which party we most likely will be affiliated with. So historically in Florida, you see a strong Cuban American voting bloc that, because of the communist rule in Cuba and how they came here to the United States, are very much in because of a lot of history that probably a lot of us know about, including the Bay of Pigs, are very strong. It's a very strong bloc for Republicans traditionally. What's happening in Florida, which is interesting, is that there's a larger Puerto Rican community vote coming out too. Puerto Ricans, in large part, because of the relationship with the United States, as citizens born in the island or not, you're automatically a citizen, are most likely Democratic Party affiliated, not often. So what you're seeing in Florida is really interesting because you have the Cuban vote that is about 28% and the Puerto Rican vote that's about 26%. And now you're hearing a lot about the South American vote, which is less than 4% of the vote. Why are you hearing a lot about it is because of what's happening in Venezuela, and that motivates the Cuban vote. All this to say, it gets really complicated when you're talking about Latinos and the electorate. Here in California, it is predominantly dominated by the Mexican American voter. There's just no ifs, ands about it. You are seeing a strong Central American influence, and that you're starting to see that too in the elected officials that start representing Latino communities, which is fantastic. Once again, both of those communities, different motivations of why they perhaps immigrated to the United States, and also gives different, can lead to different alignment. So if you immigrated mostly because of economic reasons, which is traditionally the Mexican American experience, you're going to be more aligned with the Democratic Party. You feel those policies are more aligned. If you came here and feel that you went through a certain trajectory and feel that everyone should go through that same trajectory, you're going to be a little bit more in line with the Republican Party. So oftentimes you'll see this big headline news of 20% of Latinos are moving in one direction. That's still, in every pollster will tell you, that's a failing grade. Who wants just 20%? You want to get the larger number. So all this to say is that you have to really look into the data, understand the motivation of the Latino population in your state, of why they are voting the way they are, and that no one votes the same way. And even within the Latino community, immigration is one piece of how, not so much the issue of immigration, but how you immigrated to the country, if you did immigrate to this country. But the other piece is generationally. So we see in the generation in Latinas, and specifically a much more progressive voter coming from millennials and Generation C. That is a huge shift from more of a moderate conservative voter from Generation X and for the baby boomers. So a lot of complications there. Gender plays a huge role as well, as Latinas and Latinos don't always seem to see the world the same way. So very complicated, and there's a lot to unpack there, but I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of flavor about the complexity of the community.
Well, we could spend another hour just on the differences between the way Latino and Latinas see the world, but we should probably save that for another program. Let's stick with politics for today. And Michael Lawson, I'm gonna turn to you next, because I know that you and the LA Urban League have spent a great deal of time focusing on the challenge of voter turnout in this election. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your work in that area, and perhaps with some historical context to help explain its import.
Certainly, thank you very much for this, and I really appreciate what the Holocaust Museum of LA is doing. This is such an important session, as are all of the sessions that you have. The turnout for the African American community. there are so many different factors that affect the turnout. When you talk about historical perspective, a big part of it is, quite frankly, the election of Barack Obama to be president of the United States in 2008. The incredible turnout there was for obvious reasons. But what it left in its wake were a number of younger African-American citizens who want to have that feeling again. In other words, this was in 2008 and 2012, there was no sense of a question as to who the vast majority of African Americans wanted to vote for. But that was the only time, to be perfectly candid, in the history of my voting era. It has always been the lesser of two evils. With the exception of Barack Obama's election, we were always just seeking out the person that might listen to our concerns more than the other. But there was no absolute, this is the person that we want to vote for. And what has happened in the wake of President Obama's terms is you have this portion of our electorate that, quite frankly, is looking for that feeling again. And they're saying, I'm not going to vote because I don't like either one enough. I don't like either one, either candidate to the same extent that I wanted to see Obama in the White House. And I have to remind people that I talk to that that was an aberration. That was something that you can't wait for that to come around again before you vote. And the fact of the matter is that the landscape has changed over the decades over the history that you mentioned. So you start with the fact that it was the Republican Party that, through Lincoln, ended slavery. And so for decades following the Emancipation Proclamation, Black folks voted Republican 100% down the line. That was it. There was no question about it. And in fact, it was the Democratic Party that was, quote unquote, that has always been kind of a bigger tent, if you will. But the portions of the political landscape that were the more white supremacists were the Democrats. The Southern Democrats were, I mean, George Wallace was a Democrat. When he ran for presidency in 1968, he ran as a Democrat. The Southern Democrats left the Democratic Party and joined the Republican Party, and to a great extent have co-opted the Republican Party in that sense, and kind of changed the landscape. But even with that movement, you go back to when Robert Dole ran for presidency, both parties were dominated by the middle. So you had fringe actors on the Democratic side, you had fringe actors on the Republican side, but the control of the party, and therefore the various parties, and therefore the control of the country as a whole, were dominated by people who maintained the middle. I recall when Senator Dole was running for president, he resigned from the Senate in order to dedicate his time to the campaign, and his resignation speech surprised me because it sounded like he was a Democrat. He talked about the American with Disabilities Act. He talked about food stamps. These are things that he was proud of as a Republican. So what you have now is a much more polarized set of people who are dominating these parties. The people who dominated the middle are still there on both ends of the party, but their voices are silent. So because of that, the vote is actually that much more important. It is so much more important that we select a candidate that is willing to listen to what our concerns are, what our complaints are, what our issues are, where we want to move this country so that it can achieve the greatness that is implied in our Constitution. But so in what we have now, and I'll stop, is a generation of Black Americans who have they enjoyed the ability to vote for Barack Obama so much that they don't want to do it in the absence of they want that feeling again, and it's not there. As a 501c3, I can't talk about which candidate I support, but what we are telling our constituents is you have to vote, and the evidence that your vote counts is clear in the amount of energy and time and money that is being spent on suppressing the ability of our constituents to vote. So we are going, our mantra is simple. You have to vote. You have to tell your neighbors to vote. You have to tell your friends to vote. Everybody has to get out and vote in this election. You have to be registered, and you have to make sure that the efforts to suppress your vote do not work. Everybody's vote has to count.
I think your point about voter motivation is critically important. I tell my students, I said, we are constitutionally required to hold a presidential election every 4 years. There is no requirement in the Constitution to have an inspirational, motivational, transformative candidate to vote for every 4 years. And different people will define different candidates in different ways. Some may find it this year and have not found it 4 or 8 years ago. But it's an obligation whether or not your heart skips a beat on the way into the polling place or not. So I'm very glad you raised the point. Nancy, this is one of a myriad of challenges that I know you've thought about and that cause Center for Asians United for Self-Empowerment has thought about as it relates to the political impact of the Asian Pacific community. Can you offer our audience here today some insight in what the APA community is doing and has done in this context?
Sure. I think it's always fun to be on this because I feel like it also highlights how our communities across the board are very similar, actually. In listening to my peers on this panel, I felt like myself resonating with so many things that were said just for our own community. Partly the impact of history, and not just our history from the places where we immigrate from, but also the history of how we're treated here in the United States, impacting our communities and how we vote. And I think that's very true for the Asian and Pacific Islander community as well. And I also think just when Helen was sharing about the diversity of the community, that's so true for us, whether we're talking nationally and where the different ethnic groups are nationally, regionally, why generationally we may be conservative or not. I think so many of the things that Helen shared are true for us as well. So I'm not going to reiterate them, but I just want to bring that to the top in that that's so true for us. And yet again, another reason why it's important for us to have these conversations together, because they are things we're facing together. I think for our community, the thing we're also seeing that is unique here in California, so I'll bring that up as well. This is where the highest percentage of Asian and Pacific Islanders per state are in the United States. And so We make up actually 17% of the eligible voters here in California. And for me, that's really noticeable because I think also there's this feeling of not being heard, not being seen in our community, which is something I think a little bit, not just to wanting a candidate, but wanting a candidate that listens to us. And because of our diversity, we just really want to be able to make that, stamp that on, like I think the process. And some of that is about language access. So for us, there's so many languages in the Asian and Pacific Islander community that language access can be a huge barrier, especially when 75% of our population speaks a language other than English in their homes. It doesn't mean that English isn't spoken in their home, but it means that there's a lot of different languages, but also a lot of need for language access. And so I think for me about voter education, not just knowing how the issues impact us, but understanding them in our own languages can be key to being informed voters. I will say also that we noticed 38% of our population also doesn't affiliate with a certain party, which means we also see that there isn't necessarily one side that is really looking out and hearing for our communities. And for me, that's a key opportunity, but also it says, like, what are we doing to reach out to these folks to help inform them as well? And so for us, that's a little bit of the trends that we see, is that there is a little bit of a decline in folks heading to the polls if there isn't language access, or the nervousness also about not having language access as well. But yes, that's what we're seeing in our communities.
Well, thank you to Nancy, and thanks to all of you for offering us that overview in that. I also want to remind our audience members that there's a Q&A function that Zoom provides. And if you have questions that you'd like any of the panelists to answer, you should certainly feel comfortable sending those in, and I'll do my best to ask them. What I'd like to do now that we've talked a little bit more broadly about the challenges, I'd like to get more specific. And as Michael correctly noticed, many of our organizations do not permit an endorsement of a particular candidate. But what happens in presidential years is the critically important ballot initiatives here in California often don't get as much attention as they deserve because the presidential campaign, especially one like our current campaign, received such an overwhelming majority of public and media attention. So what I've asked each of our panelists to do is talk about one of the initiatives on the ballot. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the program today, all of our goals are primarily to educate and inform, but each of the organizations has taken positions on some of the initiatives. And so I think you'll benefit from hearing their overview and their insights, but also their explanation as to why they came down the way they did. And that's not meant to be an advocacy effort on our part, but just simply to inform you as to how particular individuals and particular organizations and particular communities react to some of the ballot measures we face. If you're looking for more comprehensive information, and I hope you are on the initiatives, I'm going to ask Safina to post in the chat box a link to a terrific website. The media organization Cal Matters has a phenomenal web presence in which they offer overviews of all of the ballot initiatives that California is going to be voting on this fall, both a written assessment and also a video overview. So in addition to hearing what our panelists have to say, I'd encourage you to check out this really, really wonderful resource for an even broader perspective on these measures. So Helen, I'm going to start with you on this one, because I know that while your organization doesn't often weigh in on ballot measures, there are some that are particularly important to the Latina and the Latino community. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about one of those.
Absolutely, Dan. So the proposition I will be speaking to today is Proposition 16. I think it's important for the California voter to note that this is an amendment to the Constitution of California, which repeals 1996 Proposition 209. For those of you that don't recall 209, Proposition 209 amended the state constitution to prohibit government institutions from considering race, sex, or ethnicity, specifically in the areas of public employment, public contracting, and public education. Therefore, Proposition 209 banned the use of affirmative action in California's public sector, while still permitting socioeconomic considerations. So the reason I selected Prop 16, as Dan has noted, Hope traditionally does not take stance on propositions. We are very proud of our role as informers, as educators on the overall ballot. But this one really was important to us for a couple of reasons. Let me share one statistic from a study that was done and the impact that Prop 209 has had on Latina businesses, not just Latina businesses, all minority-owned businesses. Since 209, it is documented that close to $1 billion worth of state contracting and local contracting that would have gone to minority-owned business firms traditionally have not gone. So we've lost in our community $1 billion a year since 2009. That was staggering, and especially since we just released our Economic Status of Latinas report, in which we know that Latinas are suffering because of the COVID-19 impact, and regardless of that, we still are very resilient. That is a startling statistic to note, that if we could have had an opportunity to compete equitably, we would have been seeing at least $1 billion more in our minority-owned firms. The other key thing is that we saw at the UC system a drop of Black and Brown students close to 12% as a result of 209. So what we're looking for is the ability to ensure that there's a level playing field and to ensure that equity is always measured, that moves forward all communities. And that's why we're in support of Proposition 16. It is important to know that it is a constitutional amendment. It does repeal 209 and does allow for affirmative action policies to be implemented to ensure an equitable playing field for all communities across the state of California.
Well, Helen, thank you very much. And once again, not to be overly repetitive, but I think it is an important point for everyone who's participating in this conversation. Our goal today is not to try to persuade or to advocate, but rather to inform. And whether you happen to agree or disagree with Helen and Hope's position on this, I think you can agree that we benefit from hearing such a considered perspective. Now that said, Nancy, there's ballot initiatives on any number of topics. There's taxes, there's employment status, there's housing. But those that have to do with race and ethnic heritage tend to be particularly emotionally fraught. And no matter what happens on November 3rd, whether Prop 16 passes or not, that leaves the potential for an awful lot of bruised feelings on the side that is ultimately not successful. I know that you and your colleagues have thought a lot about how this conversation needs to continue, regardless of the outcome of this particular initiative. And so I'm wondering since Helen has taken us up to November 3rd, I'm wondering if you can take us beyond.
Sure. I think for our community, there's a few ways of looking at this particular proposition that really are showing up on both sides. And some of it is actually around I think for me, the focus around the education piece and the conversation and really trying to understand both angles around how it will impact students and how parents feel about how it impacts students. I think for me, what we're seeing is that no matter how November 3rd turns out, there is something around being part of this conversation that's important for the Asian and Pacific Islander community, so they do understand the impact that it has on our community. I think, Helen, you just shared very concretely some of the data that you've seen, and I think that is really helpful too for us to be able to share. But then also really thinking about how do we include people in the conversations around solutions, and how do we clarify how our communities are being impacted specifically on the education side. I think that there is a huge, I know for me, so I'm a Chinese Filipino second generation, and education is a huge part of how my parents speak to me. But it's always very driven by testing and merit and really talking about how we need to earn it. And I think there is something also very cultural in the language of how it's presented to our communities that could also help us to understand and clarify and be part of solutions post as well. And so I believe that no matter which side, I think it's important for our community to really show up afterwards and not continue to divide. So.
Right. Nancy, thank you so much. And once again, I think that all of us would agree that the value of programs like this Building Bridges series is to allow these conversations to continue. Mm-hmm. Some of you may know I worked in campaign politics for many years before fleeing to academia. And one of the things that I learned back in those days is that the single least likely time to change anyone's mind about anything is at the heat of an election season. And so regardless of the outcomes on this and on other elections, it's a good reminder on how important it is for us and others to continue to gather on November 4th and beyond, to continue these conversations, because Election Day, much more often than not, isn't the end of anything. It's really just the beginning. Michael, I know one of the issues that you've spent a lot of time thinking about, an issue that existed long before this election cycle, it will not go away on November 4th, no matter how it's resolved, are issues relating to criminal justice. We've talked about them in the past on previous programs. One of the initiatives, and there's a few on the ballot this fall that examines that area, is Proposition 25, which raises the critically important question of bail for those accused of criminal activity. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that for all of us.
My pleasure. This is a very important proposition, but the confusion is not just about the bail system, it's about the proposition system as well. In 2018, the legislature passed a state law, SB 10, which eliminated the bail system and put in place a system whereby people who are arrested, the determination of whether they would be held in jail pending a court hearing would be based on a determination of public safety or flight risk and things of that nature, and not on the basis of whether they had the resources to get bail. I mean, bail basically is a system of, if you have enough money, you can be out of jail. If you don't have enough money, you're kept in jail until your court hearing, regardless of whether you're a flight risk, a safety issue to the community, or what have you. And it's an outdated system that needs to be undone. And I am unapologetic about my position on that. The confusion here is that the bill passed, and but but under California law, you can, if you get enough signatures, you can have a proposition that is a referendum on that statute. So Prop 25 is a referendum on that statute. If you vote yes on Proposition 25, you're saying yes to SB 10, which is the statute that eliminated the bail system and set up a system that I just described. If you vote no, SB 10 does not become a state law, and the bail system is reinstated. So this is one of these situations where the Los Angeles Urban League is unapologetic about saying that we hope everybody votes yes on this. We move away from the bail system, which is tantamount to debtor's prison for people who are arrested regardless of before they have been convicted of anything. They're held in jail because they don't have enough money. When you look at the organizations that support and oppose Prop 25. It's confusing. A lot of people, when they look at these propositions, they will make their decisions based on the organizations that that they agree with most of the time, which ones are suggesting that you vote yes and which ones suggesting that you vote no. In the opposing organizations list, you will not be surprised that the California Bail Agents Association is front and center on that. What you might be surprised to see is that the California Black Chamber of Commerce and the California Hispanic Chambers of Commerce are both suggesting a no vote on Proposition 25, which would reinstate the bail system. And the question is, why do you have that? And the simple answer is that a significant number of African Americans and Hispanic people are in the bail economy, and it is for the bail bondsman. This is a very lucrative business, and if this if SB 10 goes into effect, that business will be demolished. I am unapologetic about saying that that's a good thing for the state as a whole, but this will be devastating for this part of the economy. And hopefully there will be efforts and not hopefully, we as the Urban League will do what we can to address the fallout that will come as a result of this for this part of this segment of our economy. But this is a change that needs to be made, and we need to address these issues appropriately.
Michael, thank you very much. And I think by acknowledging the different perspectives, even within a particular community, it underscores a point that Helen and Nancy, well, that all of you made a little bit early on, about how no community is monolithic and looks at an issue through a single lens. And so, as is the case on both this initiative and on Prop 16, we encourage you to do as much reading as you possibly can between now and the time you cast your ballot, and make sure that you cast your ballot. So, Julie, you and your colleagues at the Jewish Center for Justice have decided to take on another issue that is certainly not new to California, but there's another opportunity to address, and that's the question of affordable housing. And so maybe you can take a couple minutes and talk with us about the proposition, and then with our remaining time, we'll work in several of the really intriguing questions that we've gotten from our audience members.
Great, thanks, Dan. I'm happy to do that. So JCJ, among other propositions, including 16 and 25, we're closely watching Proposition 21, which is the rent control overhaul. And what Prop 21 would allow is for local jurisdictions to put rent control in place for all kinds of housing. That includes single family homes, condos, and townhomes. There are two exemptions. If the building is newer, so if it was first occupied within the past 15 years, and if the landlord only owns up to 2 properties. It's also important to note that this proposition would replace the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act of 1995. And under that act, landlords could raise rents after tenants move out, after a tenant moves out. Prop 21 would limit how much they can raise the rent once a property is vacated to up to 15% over 3 years. Oh, the reason the Jewish Center for Justice really supports the passage of this proposition is 2 big reasons. One, we think that allowing local governments to make their own decisions regarding rent control instead of forcing top-down state regulations on communities is important for communities to be able to do what is in the best interest of of their citizens. The proposition would also lower the number of evictions statewide, which really keeps our neighbors in their homes and not on their streets. And it's really, I think, becoming a bigger and bigger issue, especially as our economy is hurting and so many people are hurting due to coronavirus. So I think this is just very important to be thinking about right now. And also California has such an expensive housing market, as we all know. And it's important, again, to give local governments the tools they need to regulate based on their specific housing markets. This is also in line with other propositions and pieces of legislation that JCJ has supported in the past.
Great, Julie, thank you very much. And once again, a reminder for everyone who's been watching, listening to today's conversation, we really do encourage you to check out the Cal Matters voter guide on the ballot initiatives. It's Cal Matters, CalMatters.org/election 2020. And you ought to be able to, and once again, Safina has put that information up in the chat box. And we'd encourage you to, all of us to check it out. So Julie, I'm going to stick with you because one of our audience questions is very specifically about the point that you were making earlier about Jewish voting habits. And I'll read it out loud. It says, is there any elaboration and research on Jewish voters as to why Jewish Democrats put Israel so low on their priority list while Jewish Republicans put it so high? Are there any explanations on how voters came to make these priorities? And what I can tell you is there's, a huge amount of research, much of which is in conflict with each other. So instead of asking you to cite research, I'd ask for your assessment on why you think we see those divisions.
So yes, there is tons of research. My gut feeling, and from what I've read and anecdotally talking to people, there are two different solutions to peace in the Middle East. And I think that for many people for some people being pro-Israel can mean one thing, which is Israel becomes a state and there's no two-state solution. There is a one-state solution, and that's the end. For many other people, there is a two-state solution, which is a different path to peace in the Middle East. And I believe that is where the line is drawn and why there is such a differing of opinions on both sides.
I think that's very smart. I think the one thing I'd add to that, if I can take moderator's prerogative, is the questioner, I think, raises a really, really important concept for us to discuss. And it's not unique to the Jewish community or to issues relating to Israel. People become members of one party or another because they prioritize different policy matters. And somebody in the Jewish community who makes Israel their top voting issue is someone who most likely prioritizes issues relating to security on a broader landscape as well. Jewish Democrats, it's not that they don't care about Israel, but they believe, and Julie, correct me if you disagree on this, I think those Jews who rank Israel as a lower ranking priority don't do so because they don't care about Israel, but rather because they're reasonably confident that the mainstream of either of the two major parties would handle issues relating to Israel and the Middle East in a responsible way. And there's outliers in the parties, who might not see it that way. But I think you tend not to prioritize an issue if you're comfortable that both parties would handle it relatively fairly. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And the fact that when you look at the research, 95% of American Jews strongly favor Israel and are pro-Israel. I totally agree that they do believe that is an issue that will be taken care of no matter what party is in power per se. And domestic issues, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, after you. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just going to say, and domestic issues are things that that they see on a daily basis and feel in their own communities, and also our value. I mean, part of the Jewish values is to make sure that our neighbors are taken care of as well. And I think what we see and what Jews traditionally see is that we have privileges, and we have to recognize those privileges, and we have to make sure that everybody else gets those same privileges. And that's something that's very front and center in our democracy here.
Thank you very much. I want to try to work in a couple of other questions, and this one I'm going to paraphrase and ask anyone who'd like to take a shot at it, but it's a critically important one. We've talked a lot about supporting candidates who listen to complaints and concerns, but what about action? Question for anyone who'd like to take it is, what does your organization do to educate members of your community about candidates' performance once a politician is elected to office, about holding him or holding her responsible for living up to the commitments that they made while on the campaign trail? Question for anyone who'd like to talk about it in the broader concept of voter education.
I'll take a short answer. The Los Angeles Urban League is part of an affiliate organization. We have over 90 affiliates in 35 states, but we also have a national urban league that has a Washington bureau that is can do the lobbying that you're talking about. So we are not, we don't say vote for X or Y, the lesser of two evils or what have you, but we are determined to, once one's in office, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on, we have the wherewithal and we feel the obligation to press these elected officials, regardless of their party, on what issues are that affect our constituents.
Nancy or Helen, would either of you like to weigh in on that? How do you make sure that members of your organization or members of your community have the knowledge they should have in order to see whether candidates who get elected maintain the principles that they articulated on the campaign trail?
I'm going to talk briefly about, and I think to Michael's point around, I think it does take a lot of people doing the work to get it done in terms of holding people accountable. I'm lucky enough to work at an organization with someone like Charlie Wu, my board chair, who also is really passionate about language access and able to be part of it for a long time. I think it's one of the reasons I was attracted to cause, is that part of equity is also having access, and for us that is about language. So I've seen a lot of different people in our communities advocate with elected officials to make sure we have things in language. And I will say also, in terms of part of our solutions for voter education, is making sure everyone knows that those exist, those resources exist. So actually tomorrow we're having an event with the Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, to talk about the resources and the languages that are available on his website, but then also give nonprofit organizations that are doing the work on the ground an opportunity to share what they're doing and how they're reaching those communities as well, because it's not a one-size solution. So I think part of holding people accountable is the work. You kind of continue to work with these offices to make sure our communities are heard, but then also not forgetting there's a lot of people filling in those gaps in these nonprofits and doing it as well. So it's a little bit of everything, I would say. And I think it's really impressive to be amongst this group of people who does all of that. So again, just happy to be here.
And to take the point that both Nancy and Michael made and address it to other questions that have come in, what each of these organizations does very, very well is make sure that voters understand that in addition to the presidential race, like we talked about earlier, there are critically important ballot initiatives and equally critically important campaigns for down ticket offices, for local office, for legislative offices, and making sure that information is provided to members of their respective communities and to our common community. There are a couple of really smart, insightful questions about polarization and hyperpartisanship, and I'll take just a minute to address those, and I think we'll call it a day. And I'll remind you that we'll be back here again on Wednesday, November 4th, the morning after the election, when we'll either have election results to sift through or not, as the case may be. But either way, we'll be here for, in order to pick up this conversation where it leaves off. What I'd say is this, one smart question that came in is, why does it seem like the extremes in both parties have become so predominant? And the question is, what happened to the political center? Well, I had a boss in politics many, many years ago, and he used to like to say, quote, "There's no such thing as a raging moderate," unquote. And I have tried for many years to prove that wrong myself. But the point, if you take the glibness aside, is a really smart one, which is someone who is a passionate and principled progressive, or an equally passionate and equally principled conservative, is almost by definition going to be more invested in not just election, but in policy outcomes than someone in the political center. It doesn't mean there aren't passionate individuals within the 40-yard lines, but by definition, you become more ideologically intense when you care deeply about something. I think the greatest challenge that we face as a society when it comes to American politics, and one of the reasons we have these building bridges conversations every month, is to remind ourselves and remind each other that even people with very, very strong and principled opinions, like all of us, can find common ground and can find room for compromise. One other message that I try to share with my students every semester is I tell them that the difference between politics and football is that in politics, the victories come in between the 40-yard lines, when principled people on both teams are willing to come out of their end zones and maybe not come all the way to midfield, but at least to that space between the 40s where they can work together. One questioner asked about the potential for a constitutional crisis. And there's no question that our election system in the next 27 days is going to be tested in a way that it never has been before. We'll talk more on November 4th about how well we're handling those challenges. But the one point I'd make, the 2 points I'd make to all of you before we call it a day, is point number one, remember, and we've talked about this before, remember that given the very heavy influx of voting by mail this year as a result of the pandemic, know that we might not have results on election night. And if we don't have results that night, that's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. And while all of us impatient people would like to know as soon as the polls close who won each election, if election day does turn into election week or weeks, we have to remind each other to stay patient and to stay calm. We'll look, and then the second and even more important point is whether you vote for the initiatives my friends articulated or whether you vote against them, whichever candidate for president or for Congress or for local office you vote for, just vote. Vote early, get your mail ballot in early, go to the voting centers as early as you can. But if you don't vote, I promise you, there's someone else out there who stands for everything that you abhor, who is going to vote. And so you owe it to yourself and the rest of us to cast a ballot on election day. Thanks so much, as always, to Julie Bank, to Helen Torres, to Michael Lawson, and to Nancy Yap for joining us for a phenomenal conversation. Thanks to Michelle Gold and the entire team, Jill and Safina and the whole rest of the team at the museum. And Michelle, I'll turn it back to you for us to wind up. Or perhaps not. Perhaps I will wind up. And I will thank all of you once again for being with us and remind you once again that we'll be back here the morning after the election. So we'll be here at 11 o'clock, even if you stay up late on election night, like I think all 5 of us are going to do. We'll be here at 11 the next day to talk over what we've learned and what we may still have to learn. So I hope everyone has a great day. Don't forget to vote. We'll see you on the other side.